Welcome to Center for Korean Studies lecture series, everyone. My name is Nojin Kwak. I'm a director of the Center for Korean Studies. I am very excited today to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Deborah Solomon. She was our star graduate student when she was here until past August, right? And she's a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University. She's affiliated with both the Reischauer Institute for Japanese Studies and the Korean Institute. She spent significant amount of time at this center and Korean study program while she was here. She spent more time than anybody else here, except for Elder now. And also, the most amazing accomplishment that she had here is that she was winner of NAM's essay contest. So she has a lot of things on her plate here at Michigan. Beginning in fall of 2010, she will join the Department of History and Political Science at Audubon College in Ohio as an assistant professor of Asian history. Her interest is in colonial period in Korea under Japanese colonial ruling. Title of today's talk is Critical Voices, Contested Spaces, Special Transformations, and the Emergence of Anti-Japanese Protest in Colonial Korea. Please join me welcoming Dr. Solomon.
Thank you very much, Professor Kwak. I am so honored to be here. As you heard, and I think most of you know, I just finished my PhD from University of Michigan, and I would especially like to thank the Center for Korean Studies, the director, and of course, Jiyoung Lee, who did an amazing job, as usual, of coordinating my visit, and who the staff and faculty work very, very hard here, so I'm very honored to be here, and thank you very much. I also wanted to say that I hope that I have been here in the time that I've been at Michigan, as we were talking about over lunch. I have seen a huge expansion of Korean studies on campus, and so I am very much hoping and assuming that I will be the first in a very long series of lectures by graduates from the University of Michigan who have, like me, enthusiastically attended many of these talks and participated enthusiastically in all kinds of Korean studies events on campus. So thank you very much again. And the title of my talk today, let's see, I think that there are no screws in this, so I think that it goes in and out. They said that, I think we might, there we go, okay. So I'm not gonna touch anything. I'm gonna stand a little bit away. But the title of my talk today is quite a mouthful. It's Critical Voices and Contested Spaces, Spatial Transformations and the Emergence of Anti-Japanese Student Protest in Colonial Korea. And that's actually a relatively vague title. What I'm really going to be talking about is these kinds of contested spaces in a single Japanese anti-Japanese Korean student movement that happened from 1929 and 1930 on the Korean Peninsula. And so that's really what I'm going to be focusing on today, are transformations of public space and the emergence of student protesters specifically, because there was also, of course, independence protests 10 years earlier than the protests I'm going to be talking about, but I'm going to be focusing specifically on students. Japanese colonial rule created new spatial conceptions on the Korean Peninsula, both by transforming public spaces in Korea and by requiring Koreans to imagine themselves as members of a larger Japanese empire. It was within this framework, in turn, that the new subject position of the student protester emerged. From 1924 onward, Korean students frequently staged boycotts, sparked by conflicts with unpopular teachers, disagreements in the classroom, and general dissatisfaction with the Japanese education system and with colonial rule as a whole. These small-scale regional protests culminated in a peninsula-wide student protest movement in 1929 and 1930, beginning in the southwestern city of Gwangju and spreading throughout Korea. And today I'm going to be exploring the outbreak of these protests and their spread throughout Korea, as well as the protest manifestos that students distributed as a crucial part of their anti-Japanese resistance. The outline of the talk is I'm going to be talking a little bit about the ways in which education reforms in the early 1920s on the Korean Peninsula created new spaces and new modes of public interaction. And I'm also going to be talking a little bit about the ways in which students formed secret reading groups to read Marxist literature in private outside of the purview of Japanese colonial authorities, and how as student protest emerged, it came out of these kind of secret spaces and into the streets, the use of protest manifestos emerged as a key protest strategy. And I'm going to ask how some of the complexities and ambiguities in these manifestos operated within the transformation of public space in this period. So as a response to the March 1st movement in 1919, which was the largest anti-Japanese and pro-independence movement of the colonial period, Japanese colonial administrators on the Korean government and the Korean Peninsula implemented a series of educational reforms as one of the parts of the reforms that were put into place. So this statistic of 11,000 students participating out of a student population of 133,557 is actually from Japanese police records and is the lowest. These statistics are controversial, but this is the lowest estimated number of student participants. So there was a significant, even though they were a small percentage of students in 1919, there were a significant enough number of them that part of the reforms that took place after 1919 involved reforming the school system. And so in 1922, a new colonial education law, or the Korean education law called the Chosón 교육규례, was issued. This was the second of three revisions of the education law, and a massive government general wave of school construction and expansion was undertaken throughout Korea. After hastily revised textbooks were rushed into Korean classrooms immediately after the March 1st movement, the Government General of Korea issued new, carefully reworked textbooks into Korean schools in 1923, which supposedly reflected the new outlook of the Japanese colonial government towards Korea in the aftermath of March 1st, that of Ishijojin, or as Mark Peedy translates it, impartiality and equal favor. So this second revision of the colonial Korean education law was theoretically supposed to ameliorate some of these tensions between Japanese and Korean students on the peninsula and give a sense of equal access to education. And one of the law's most striking features, which other scholars have also talked about, is the fact that it covered education in Korea, Chosón ni okeru kyoiku, meaning that it included schools for Japanese students as well as for Korean students under its purview. And the previous education law had only covered Chosonjin no kyoiku, or education for Korean students specifically. And similarly, in distinguishing primary schools that were aimed at Japanese students as opposed to those intended for Korean students, the law did not specifically specify students' nationality and instead classified Korean schools as providing instruction for those who do not regularly use the national language, kokugo joyo sezaru mono ni. And in this case, by national language, they meant Japanese and not Korean. And by making the separation of schools a matter of purely linguistic expedience rather than one of nationality-based discrimination, the newly promulgated education law sought to diminish the impression that the government general offered preferential treatment to Japanese students attending schools on the Korean Peninsula. And despite these clear attempts to at least officially diffuse fixed social distinctions between Korean and Japanese students, there were other ways in which the law inadvertently reinforced different social divisions. For example, male and female students were to be educated separately, female students were, unlike their male peers, were specifically trained to be mindful of cultivating their female morality as one element of their training to become national citizens. And another element of these education policies that were called on aggregate bunkaseiji, or cultural rule, was the dramatic increase in the number of schools themselves. So in the 1920s, school construction was undertaken throughout Korea, and just as an example of the scope on which these schools expanded, Korean public common schools, which were the equivalent of elementary schools or primary schools at the time, there were 450 throughout the Korean peninsula, 1,189 by 1925, and 1,776 by 1931. So that was a huge spike in the sheer number of schools in addition to these new education policies. And what the ultimate impact of these kinds of school construction policies and the shifts in educational policies, the impact that this brought about was actually, by the late 1920s, to overproduce educated Koreans. And by that I mean there were far more graduates of Korean schools on the Korean peninsula than there were jobs or positions for them within the Japanese empire, either within Japan or within Korea itself. And so there were many, many educated and unemployed Koreans by the end of the 1920s, especially because the economic downturn of 1929, a phenomenon that I know that we're all familiar with, caused a lot of exchange students from Korea who had been studying in Japan and in other places to run out of funding to continue their studies and to have to come back to their hometowns. And there is a very famous short story written about just such a disgruntled student called A Ready-Made Life. And this is just a short quote from that, talking about how originally Koreans had been very excited about this expansion of schools and expansion of opportunities, but soon, by the end of the 1920s, it was as if the intellectuals were lured into climbing the ladder of success, only to have it pulled out from under them. These rejects were dispirited and jobless, a powerless, cultured reserve force, and they heaved great sighs. They were like dogs who had lost their masters and become unwanted. So this is somewhat dramatic language, but this is kind of the feeling in the air as we move into this era of student protest, a really intense era of student protest. And meanwhile, one of the things that these returning graduates and students throughout Korea were doing was forming a lot of students who were coming back from Japan and from other areas, but especially from schools in Japan, brought with them different kinds of Marxist literature, not only Japanese translations of Marx, but also Marxist works and anarchist works by Japanese writers. And sometimes they would translate them into Korean, and other times they would read them in Japanese in these secret reading groups. And here is, I'm going to actually skip forward one. Here is a picture, a commemorative picture taken in 1926 of one of these student movement groups, these secret reading groups. It's sort of funny because they were secret, but they did take this commemorative picture. But as I will show you later, that doesn't seem to be that, people, as soon as these protests broke out, suddenly there were a lot of different evidence emerged of various people sort of, having been meeting in secret and things like that. And the Japanese police, when they found this picture, partially used it to track down who had been members of this group. So this group formed in 1926 in the city of Gwangju, which is where these protests started a few years later. And they held their first meeting in student Che Kuchang's room in a Gwangju boarding house in 1926. More than 14 students gathered and created a secret society based on the following 3 tenets. And these are, we will fight for Korean independence from under Japanese rule. We are absolutely opposed to Japanese colonial slave education. And we demand freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom to form organizations. And I just want to point out a couple things. This kind of rhetoric is important because as soon as I move into the manifestos, you're going to see some repetition in these kinds of themes. But there are a couple things that I want to point out here. Number one, even though they were studying Marxist literature, they didn't mention anything about Marxism in their original, in this original document. And it seems like a lot of times the Marxist language took a while to kind of percolate to the surface. We'll see as we go through the manifestos that that definitely one of the most common demands throughout this entire process is this: we are absolutely opposed to Japanese colonial slave education. And I'm not exactly sure when this phrase, where this phrase initially came from, but all kinds of independence groups, and not just independence groups that were associated with Marxist readings, use this expression, but it's not something that we see in the March 1st movement of 1919. So this is definitely a new thing related to this movement. This is obviously something that we saw in March 1919 as well. And the freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom to form organizations is also a recurring demand of students, and something that we also had seen some evidence of. So the biggest kind of change in language, as evidenced here from previous manifestos, is this reference to colonial slave education. So this student reading group met during 1929 and early 1930. And even in its earliest inception, they were extremely organized. And at the first meeting, students were assigned the positions of accountant, clerk, and general affairs manager, and determined that the club would meet on the first and third Saturday of every month, and set the monthly membership fee at 10 chon, which would have been like pocket change for these students. It was about half of the price of a cheap meal in colonial Korea at this time. And the students present decided to pursue their main activities, that their main activities would be to pursue their goals with utmost solemnity, to work towards expanding their membership base, and to maintain secrecy. I'm just going to go back 2 slides just to show you. This is the first students were all from this one higher common school, and the very first reading group that I was talking about formed here, and a lot of the and these pictures were actually taken in the early 1930s, but this is just what the classroom that they were coming from looked like. And then moving on to, they met secretly reading Marxist literature through 1926 and 1927, and in 1928 disbanded because one of the relatives was discovered to have, one of the members was discovered to have a blood relative in the Gwangju police force, and the group feared detection. But they continued to, they separated, and in 1928 they branched out and began to form a series of other secret reading groups at different schools in the city of Gwangju. And one thing that's really important is that as the student protests, which I'm about to get to in a second, as these student protests began, and the Japanese police, colonial police began to investigate how students had been able to organize so quickly, they found that there were these kinds of secret reading groups meeting all over the Korean peninsula. And in Gwangju, they had particularly active reading groups, but there were lots of other reading groups in other areas as well. This was not at all a phenomenon that was limited to the city of Gwangju. And one of the protest participants who had been in the initial secret reading group named Lee Ki-hong said that the kinds of things that they would do in the secret reading group was to get together, and one of the returning students from Japan, Kim Sang-hwang, would assign short sections to each of the younger students, who would then present the section that they'd read at the group's next meeting. And the meetings were conducted in utmost secrecy, he maintains, saying that we would gather at places like the bakery that Chang Tae-sung managed, and this was another returning student who had come back to Gwangju and started a Western-style bakery, and in the back of this bakery they would meet and read these Marxist texts and talk about them. And this participant says that we changed our meeting place frequently, going from places like a newlywed couple's room to the back room of a house that was in mourning, Shinhon Bububang Ina Sangachiwi Kolbang, and these kinds of places that are really kind of these marginal, not just sort of out-of-the-way places, but also places where normally political talk and kind of independence activism would not be suspected, because they were really kind of these personal spaces. And so, according to E, at these meetings, after we presented the portion of the reading for which we were responsible, we were always expected to connect it to real life, and then we'd open the floor to criticism and debate. We would be told to come to the next meeting, having carefully studied any parts of the reading that we'd been unable to settle in the current meeting. At the next meeting, we would settle any unclear issues. Because we all debated and critiqued the material for a fixed amount of time each meeting while we studied, ideologically there was very little difference between us. And another participant in this same secret reading group, Kook Sung-jung, says that we would read a book and the next day it would be passed along to the next person to read, things like that. The name of the leader was carefully guarded and you could never say it. We strictly protected the secrecy of the organization, and we read all about socialism. And I thought, of course, in this world, organizations shouldn't be hierarchical. We have to make things lateral. Readings from the socialist, reading these Marxist readings gave me that feeling. Things shouldn't only be organized from the top down. We have to become a society where things move from side to side. Yoko kara yoko ni. That's how it felt. So he is a Korean student protest participant, but I conducted the oral interview with him in Japanese as his choice. So anyway, but it's ironic because these students are studying these readings in which they're thinking a lot about disbanding the hierarchies of society, but if you look at the way that these reading groups are actually functioning, they're actually intensely hierarchical in the ways that that they are organized and the way that the readings and discussions are carried out. And so these various reading groups are expanding in different schools around the Gwangju area, and there are a number of incidents on the trains and in the city of Gwangju building up to the outburst of the outbreak of the first student protests. But just to give you an example of the kinds of tensions that were sort of in the air and the kinds of conflicts that were happening, in June 1929, according to police records, Japanese middle school students were commuting from school on a train, and they saw a Korean by the side of the road cooking a dog, and apparently, according to the police records, said that it was barbarous. And according to the police records, it was muttered under their breath. But again, there's always a lot of conflict between what the police records say and what eyewitnesses report and things like that. But apparently the Japanese student muttered yaban under his breath, and a fight ensued at the train station involving about 30 students before it was broken up by the police. So this was in June of 1929. And in January 1928, there was a conflict along kind of similar ethnic lines between Korean and Japanese members of the Southern Chola Provincial Council, which is the province in which Gwangju is located, in which one Japanese member made a discriminatory remark that it was futile to discuss the expansion of Korean educational facilities, given the low level of Korean economic power. And the Korean members of the Provincial Council took this Japanese comment as an insult against the Korean people, and the heated argument that ensued, and this is from a dissertation by Uchida Jun, the heated argument that ensued turned the floor, quote unquote, into almost a scene of carnage. So you have these kind of tensions in which Koreans are being represented as uncivilized, as beast-like, and things like that, and that there are a number of incidents that are being narrated along the lines of these kind of tensions between Japanese and Koreans. And finally, on October 30th, 1929, a fight between Korean and Japanese students broke out on a train. And Takabe Kinichi, who is the Japanese official serving as the head of the Academic Affairs Bureau of the Government General at the time, later reported again that the fight had begun entirely innocently. Two Japanese middle school students on their way home from school, Takabe wrote in his government report, had been playing around in front of the ticket gate as they left Naju Station, and Naju is about 15 miles outside of Gwangju. And they had moved to dodge a small child, at which point they accidentally stepped in front of a female Korean student who was also returning from school. Her brother, who was with her, the report went on to note, exchanged words with the Japanese students, demanding to know why they were displaying such contemptuous behavior and running back and forth in front of a female student, quote unquote, and started a fight with them. And this, again, is a contested account. Later historians have claimed that actually the Japanese students were harassing the female student in the train, and then a story has begun after the colonial period saying that the Japanese students actually pulled the hair of the female Korean student, but there's no evidence in the primary documents at the time of anything like that happening. But that is sort of the rhetorical way in which this fight is often remembered in Korea today. And so this fight happened on the train and in the train station. And finally, the Korean student whose sister was the object of this conflict punched the Japanese students involved, and this is a picture of the student who threw the first punch on the train. And one of the things that I want to point out here about him is you can see how young he is. He was about 15 years old in this picture, and basically the way that the colonial Korean education system worked is that it was modeled on the Japanese education system, but the number of years for Korean students was reduced, especially in rural areas. And so you had common schools for Korean students, which were between 4 and 6 years, depending on what the budget of their province and things like that were. And then you had higher common school for Korean students, and the equivalent for the Japanese students on the Korean peninsula was middle school or chugakko, but the problem was that both of these schools were a little bit shorter, even on the Japanese, for the Japanese students in Korea, than the school system was in Japan, which meant that even Japanese students educated on the Korean peninsula were at an educational disadvantage if they went back to Japan and had to take an extra year of preparatory courses in order to go into university. But even so, these students are technically middle school students, but they're really sort of the equivalent of high school students because there wasn't the same kind of high school institution. So this student is about 15. Most of the students involved in the student protests were between 15 and 19, and you can see there's no required age there's no compulsory education for Korean students throughout the colonial period, and there was no required age to enter school on the Korean side. And you can see a really big fluctuation in the Japanese police reports as they arrest student protesters of students in the same year in school will be within 2 or 3 years difference in age, whereas the Japanese students, anytime Japanese students are reported on, their ages are very, very consistent, depending on the year that they were attending school. But this is one of the students, and he was about 15. And basically what happens is, I'm sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but these students get in a fight on October 30th, and there are a lot of tensions on the trains over the next few days, even after this fight is broken up by the police and the station agent who was working at the time. And the day after the fight breaks out, a local Japanese language newspaper prints an article that sympathizes with the Japanese students and portray the Korean students as having attacked the Japanese students. And this is part of what contributes to the growing tension for several days from October 30th to November 3rd. And finally on November 3rd, which coincides with the anniversary of the Meiji Emperor's birthday, all students on the Korean Peninsula are required to go to shrine services in various cities throughout Korea in order to commemorate the Meiji Emperor. And on the way back, a huge fight breaks out between Korean and Japanese students in the area around Gwangju Station, which is right here. And their teachers get involved and break up the fight, and students retreat to their individual schools, at which point they kind of regroup and plan a citywide protest movement, and they begin the students starting at this higher common school, which is the students that were smack dab in the middle of the fight, begin protesting in, they have a meeting back at school in which they decide to take to the streets, and they begin marching, and they march throughout the city of Gwangju. And part of what I was talking about this expansion of schools and why it has such a big impact on student protest is this is the train line running through Gwangju at the time, and this is Gwangju Station, which was built in about 1914. And this is the Japanese middle school, and this Japanese middle school it was built right in the Protectorate period, right before 1910, and this is Gwangju Higher Common School. It was also built in 1908, but the other three schools here were all built between 1921 and 1926, which means that you have a huge increase in the population of Korean students just in this little area, and all of them who do not live in the dorms at school or in the immediate neighborhoods around the schools are going to be commuting through this train station. So this is kind of the type of transformation that I'm talking about in terms of with Japanese colonialism in general. We get an increase in the building of schools, and then especially with these school reforms, we get this huge number of schools. So, so the students take to the streets on November 3rd, 1929. They staged these really big street protests, and this is Naju Station where the fights first broke out, and this is Naju Station in 1929, and this is what it looked like in 1926. And it was closed down for train transport in about 2001, and they had wanted to create a memorial museum there, and for a long time the city of Naju didn't have enough money to do anything with this building, so it just sat there completely empty. And there was actually, in 2003, there was a real estate developer that was considering turning it into a theme park, although it was not going to have anything to do with Korean student protest. But that didn't end up going anywhere. And finally, I heard in 2008 they did end up building an Independence Museum here. And these are pictures of the initial street protests in Gwangju. And as you can see in these protests, there were actually, even from the very beginning, a lot of female students who were participating. And these are clashes between students. And this picture was actually taken from a memorial museum in Gwangju. It's one of their displays, and I took this picture again in 2006. And what's really interesting about the post-colonial representation here is in the bottom picture, in the top picture, it's very difficult to tell who are police and who are students and exactly what's going on. And this is really the best quality. I mean, the original photograph looks like this. And in this representation, there are about as many police as there are student protesters, and there's one female student who is here in the foreground, and she's on the receiving end of this Japanese police man or hitting her with a stick here. So anyway, but these are some of the street protests as they broke out. And so this protest activity breaks out on November 3rd. The Japanese colonial government in Seoul immediately sends representatives to Gwangju to investigate the scene and to report back and to try to take action so that there are not repeated protests. But in the same period, members of these student reading groups also send covert messages to Seoul saying that they're in the process of organizing the student protest. And 6 days later, when the schools reopen on November 12th in the morning, students once again stage massive street protests, not only in Gwangju, but in surrounding areas throughout the province of Southern Chola. And this is sort of the start of the protest activity. And so activism lasted in total from early November 1929 to March 1930. And approximately 54,000 students from 194 schools across the Korean Peninsula participated. And prison terms were issued for more than 180 students in Gwangju alone. And it became the second largest peninsula-wide colonial Korean protest movement after the March 1st, 1919 movement. And it's a little bit hard to see here, but this is a map that has some of the dates of the protest activity as it spread throughout the Korean Peninsula. And I just to make it a little bit easier, this is Gwangju, and this is Seoul, and this is the last recorded protest activity on this map, which is on March 3rd, but actually there is also in the police records something recorded on March 5th as well. And so students had been working covertly. These secret reading groups had also formed organizations with other national groups in Korea, such as the Shinganhwae, which was formed on January 19th, 1927, and which was within a year of its founding had more than 100 branches throughout Korea and a membership of over 10,000 people. But the Shinganhwae was a group formed with Japanese government approval as an expressly non-Marxist organization. But because police repression of Marxists from 1925 to about 1927 had resulted in there being in a lot of communist activity going underground, a lot of Marxists and communists joined the Shinganhwaes covertly and worked through the Shinganhwaes auspices with student protesters and helped them to organize their protests and to communicate with each other. And Korean historians in general have categorized the initial outbreak in Gwangju and the surrounding areas as the first phase of this movement, and it usually is considered to last sort of through November. And then the second phase, which is this movement to Seoul here, is in which the Gwangju student movement spread to Seoul, or Keijo at the time, Pyongyang, Hangheung, and a lot of other regions throughout the Korean Peninsula, but mostly large cities. And then the third phase of the movement was when the protest movement spread outward again to smaller and smaller areas in the throughout the peninsula. So in the fear that, and so meanwhile, the Japanese colonial police began to investigate these protests immediately and to try to figure out who was behind it. This is actually one of the things that they did immediately. This is from an extra of the Chosón ilbo on January 15th, 1930. But one of the things that the colonial government did immediately was in the fear that that newspaper articles such as this type of article would encourage students to further protest in the streets. From November 12th to November 28th, 1929, all newspapers were prohibited from printing news about the Gwangju student protests. In the end of December, once they're allowed to begin printing again, they actually begin printing huge amounts of articles, sort of retroactively trying to trace the activity. And one of the and there's some really interesting things in these retroactive articles, and one of which, something that comes out really clearly in the newspapers, even before it comes out clearly in the police records, is the degree to which students used manifestos as a key element of their student protest. And in 1929, in December 29th, 1929, just after the ban on newspaper reporting, it ended, an issue of the Tonga Ilbo reported that on December 3rd, there had been protests all over Seoul, beginning with Keijo Imperial University, and every school in Seoul at the middle school level or higher, every Korean school at the middle school level and higher engaged in some form of protest. And this article claims that 23,000 protest manifestos were scattered in the streets, but I haven't been able to verify that with the police records, but that's just what the newspaper claimed was happening. But we definitely know that a huge number of protest manifestos were being distributed as part of these protest activities. And here are some shots of the police arresting students and students awaiting trial for boycott activity in Gwangju itself. But I'm going to talk just a little bit about these manifestos. So Korean scholars have looked a little bit at these manifestos and talked about how we can interpret them. And so, for example, Chang So-kung has argued that these manifestos can be used to trace protest organization and spread, which is really how the Japanese police gathered and used these protest manifestos. They really were I'm going to show you some police notes in a few minutes, but they were very interested in tracking the ways in which these manifestos were moving throughout Korea. And Lee Jun-sik, who's a historical sociologist, he discusses the fact that the protest manifestos throughout the movement show increasing influence of communist ideology in their wording and things like that. So this is actually a reproduction of a protest manifesto from the second outbreak of protest activity in Gwangju. This is from the Protest Museum, and even though, according to police and academic affairs Bureau documents, 4,000 to 5,000 protest manifestos were distributed on that day. So far, the police records have copies of them, but no archives that I have been to have original protest manifestos, and even the museums they seem to have made this based on the police. I mean, I presume it's based on the police records or based on an original manifesto that is not available to the public. But this is a fairly typical manifesto in terms of the numbers of demands and things like that. The only thing that's atypical about it is the fact that it includes the student's name who wrote it, and that's very unusual. And this student was a student in a school in southern Chola province, outside of Gwangju, but not in the city of Gwangju itself. And then this is this is a copy of a protest postcard that was sent directly to the Japanese police. And usually, this is usually most protest postcards, most protest manifestos were aimed at communicating with other students or kind of in public space expressly. But in this case, this was sent directly to the Colonial police, and here the addressee claims to have been a member of a secret group that met for 12 years. But again, first of all, I'm not sure if it's a secret if you put it in your return address. And second of all, at the end, that was how they referred to themselves. But here are some of the typical protest manifesto demands. These are very consistent in general throughout the protest. So first of all, abolish Japanese colonial slave education. We've talked about this. Release arrested students and allow suspended students to return to school. Immediately halt police invasions of schools, and usually it's written in terms of invasions. Fire individual teachers and replace unqualified teachers. Rescind bad laws such as the Peace Preservation Law, and Korean independence from Japanese rule, although this does not always come very high on the list. And finally, a nation ruled by the propertyless or proletariat. There are versions of this demand that appear especially as the movement goes on. And one of the things that I want to highlight here is that these might seem like pretty straightforward demands, but actually in many cases, it's usually Japanese teachers that are being called to be fired, but there are also cases in which students call for Korean teachers to be fired. And replacing unqualified teachers, again, sounds like a very standard protest demand, but in reality, the majority of teachers that had teaching credentials were Japanese and not Korean. There was a chronic shortage of teachers throughout the entire colonial period, especially qualified Korean teachers. So in many cases, this kind of demand would have resulted, were it to have been addressed, would have resulted in the replacement of Korean teachers with Japanese teachers. And again, here is an example of a protest manifesto from early November, so just as the movement is taking off. Korean masses rise up, immediately release those arrested. We are absolutely opposed to the emergency summoning of reservist soldiers brought in to control the protests, stop the brutality of Japanese Kwangju middle school students. This was the students in the school that the students were fighting with. And again, these kind of, to me, sort of odd demands like smash the existing school parent association and call a new mass meeting of school parents. And again, give us the freedom of speech, assembly, organization, and publication. It's very interesting that student protesters who are also calling for other kinds of things like independence for Korea would also, it seems very strange to me that student protesters would call for a parents' meeting, but that's only one of many of these kinds of demands. And again, rise up under these slogans: our victory is in our solidarity and our sacrificial struggle. Immediately release those arrested, abolish school fees and school friendship society fees, and we demand self-government of the school friendship society, and we demand the freedom of speech, freedom to assemble and organize, and freedom to publish. So again, it's sort of a strange demand to mix in with these larger protest demands about ending Japanese colonialism or getting rid of Japanese colonial slave education, and then also reduce the cost. And this kind of looks to me a little bit like that old joke about the very bad restaurant in which the food is terrible and the portions are too small. I was talking with a professor of mine from Kyoto University, and we were talking about the fact that he was joking that you can understand why students are so upset because it must be particularly galling to feel like you're being overcharged for your own colonial slave education. So, I mean, it's true that we can understand students' frustration here, but this is sort of, and as the protests continue, we start getting really, really flowery language, especially in the introductory. When I showed you the sort of reproduction of the protest manifesto, there's a little introductory section in a lot of the manifestos that talks about why the students are rising up. And in those kinds of sections, we get a lot more dramatic language as the as the protests progress. And in this one, students say, "We marched in the streets for the purpose of justice, along with demanding the release of the Gwangju students. We who have been bitten by the venomous fangs of the rabid dogs of the ruling class protest in the street with our precious blood and tears." So you can see that there's really, this is the kind of dramatic linguistic turn that Lee Jun-sik is talking about when he talks about the spread of communist language and very, very dramatic kinds of language. And again, in another one of these types of introductory sections of a manifesto, beginning with the March 1st incident of nationwide slaughter, various incidents such as the large-scale massacre of Koreans during the Great Earthquake in Tokyo did nothing more than concretely illustrate the incomparable viciousness of Japanese imperialism, which, like a fierce wild animal, displays a villainous lack of reason. So here, again, it's the Japanese, not the Koreans, who are being described as animals and as being shown to have a villainous lack of reason. Again, this is a call for solidarity in the beginning of a protest manifesto. And what's interesting about this one is that another dynamic of the student movement is that as it continued and more of the Shinganhui leaders and student leaders were arrested, the Kunuhui, which was the sister organization of the Shinganhui and organized by women, a lot of Kunuhui members stepped in and worked with student protesters, and female student participation continues to grow throughout the entire movement, so that there are many protests towards the end of the movement in which the majority of participants are female students. And this is from a protest manifesto that's one of the only manifestos that the Japanese police specifically identify as being written by a female protest organizer. And I think it's really interesting here that that in this protest manifesto, it addresses our white-clothed brothers as sort of a call across gender lines. But another thing that's really interesting about this call to solidarity is the fact that in these kind of introductory sections of the manifestos, there really are not that many markers of Koreanness. The Koreans are described as people who live on the Korean peninsula, as Koreans, as and occasionally they're described as white-clothed, but that's really one of the only physical or kind of concrete markers of Koreanness that actually appears in these manifestos. So here are some, just police began to make notes about these manifestos as the protests continued, because it became clear that the protests were being used, the manifestos were being used in great numbers. And these are just some samples from the notes. They also, police describe manifestos being papering Japanese neighborhoods with Japanese businesses, for example, and being posted all over, posts all over town, and in a number of different kinds of scenarios outside of schools. And they also, the Japanese police pay an incredible amount of attention to the materiality of these manifestos, which you can see in some of these police notes. So, for example, in a really interesting incident on January 16th, 1930, several hundred manifestos, according to the police notes, are distributed at the Chosón Theater, or the Chosón Theater, Korean, written in red ink on calligraphy paper, cut into fourths, also on copy paper, and also handwritten. They sort of have these little notes about the different types of manifestos. And a summary of the contents is the immediate unconditional release of Gwangju students, also long live the small and weak. And here it's, this is the small and weak people, like Minzoku, and it's not clear as to whether this appears repeatedly in these manifestos, and it's not clear. In this manifesto, it's not clear if they're talking about Koreans or small and weak peoples throughout the world. There are manifestos that really clearly link themselves to other movements, but this one is not so clear. And then regard the violence of militarism. And the police notes say that criminals were arrested in this incident. But just to give you a scope of the kinds of things that police are writing about in their notes, they also noted that was several hundred manifestos distributed in a public place during a theater performance. They also noticed that graffiti was found on the shutters of an empty house saying "Long live Korea, long live students, long live Korean independence." And so they're noting these kinds of things as well. There are a bunch of different notes about small pieces of graffiti, as well as things like this, and this is sort of a typical type of protest manifesto. Again, this was distributed at a school, several handwritten flyers distributed in school classrooms. Summary of the contents include boycott the school principal and fight for academic independence. And again, I just want to point out that these kind of lower level or more concrete and immediate demands are something that recurs throughout the movement. This is, almost at the end of the movement, and we still have these kinds of demands for individual teachers or individual, academic freedom within the schools and things like that. And but just to give you a little bit more of the scope of the kinds of manifestos that police are finding, police reported everything from a single manifesto calling for independence for our great country Korea, written in black crayon on Korean paper, to several hundred manifestos distributed in common schools on a single day on January 25th, 1930, written on a combination of old newspapers, notebook paper, and roll paper on rolls, I guess, cut into pieces. And on January 2nd, 1930, after 2 o'clock, 3 manifestos were found found on a train, and these were written with a brush in black ink on wrapping paper that had been cut into 7 or 8 pieces. And I think it's really interesting because they said 3 manifestos had been found, so they're obviously trying to put together the paper to figure out how many pieces of paper were cut into these manifestos. In a classroom in Busan on January 8th, 1930, 3 kinds of manifestos were found. 1,800 manifestos of one type, 2,400 of a second type, and 2,200 of a third type, written on Western-style carbon paper. And even in situations where the police confiscated the manifestos that they found, they also reported that students tried to create manifestos on the spot. For example, second and third year students in a private school in Seoul in January gathered in the schoolyard and made noise, and thus were stopped by the teachers and made to go into the classroom, they said, and they had had their manifestos taken away from them. And still, officials went on to record that some fifth-year students cut their fingers and wrote in blood on handkerchiefs, "With red-blooded sincerity, in unified solidarity, destroy all obstacles and long live our demonstrations," and other such disturbing text. This is the police records. They waved the handkerchiefs as they escaped from school grounds and were promptly arrested. So that just gives you a sense of the degree to which students are committed to producing writings in the process of their protests. So what do we make of these kinds of this kind of manifesto distribution and this kind of student protest, and especially the way that manifestos create such a central part of student protest activity and yet have a lot of these contradictory demands built into them. We have seen that student protest manifestos mix communist and nationalist rhetoric with immediate concrete demands that sometimes contradicted the movement's explicit goals and sometimes even contradict goals within the manifesto itself. These contradictions can be seen as tactical. We can see that it's possible that students were assuming that they would not be able to achieve independence, and instead were hoping that they might be given some of these smaller and more concrete possibilities, but they also seem to reveal some of the ambivalences that Korean students felt in relation to the colonial state. And this is really a historical moment in the colonization of Korea, because the March 1st movement, which again was a very, very diverse movement that people protested for a number of different reasons, but when in the cases where manifestos were produced, they usually did not include this kind of tension between concrete and abstract demands. They usually just included students and other protesters really advocating for Korean independence. And so this is really a feature of this moment in the Korean, where colonialism has gone on long enough that students involved in protest activity have a hard time imagining a kind of a fully alternative education system, or a fully alternative, even though they continually advocate for Korean independence, and even though both in their secret meetings and in police interrogations and in oral interviews I've conducted, they say repeatedly that they were driven by the desire for Korean independence. It was difficult concretely for them to articulate what that independence might have entailed, and it tended to, and quality education was a really major area in which students obviously were very, very concerned. So some of these ambivalences revealed the fact that they wanted a quality education, and they weren't really sure what that might entail if the Japanese colonial apparatus was removed. And students' metaphorical language can be seen as just kind of communist language that is very common in other kinds of communist writings in Korea and in Japan at the time. But as we saw, it can also be seen as an inversion of some of the kinds of Japanese language that is used to talk about Koreans in the colonial period. It really inverts in many ways. When Japanese residents and colonial officials talk about Koreans as being animalistic or dangerous or working in mobs, things like that, they tend to describe Koreans as sort of wild and out of control, but not a directed kind of anger or dangerous bestiality, whereas when the Koreans in these manifestos, the kind of language that Korean students use, really describe Japanese rulers and the ruling class as not only animalistic, but also as really predatory and really targeting Koreans specifically. And they also, as we saw, target some of they target Japanese businesses. They walk through Japanese neighborhoods on their protest routes often, it really, and they talk a lot about Japanese colonialism itself being uncivilized rather than the Korean participants, the Korean residents of the peninsula. And so finally, both manifesto language and the distribution practices of these manifestos help students to really inscribe their own counter-narratives onto these contested public spaces. And it's true that within the counter-narratives there are a lot of contradictions, and there's not one consistent counter-narrative, but using these kind of metaphors and using a really wide range of language, the act of distributing manifestos against all odds, as we saw in some of the examples, is really a way of making sure that their voices are able to exist in this kind of contested public space. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much.